I think we are live now. Good morning, assalamu alaikum, greetings, good afternoon, wherever time zone you happen to be in. Thank you for joining us for another, hopefully, very educational and edifying stream. Today we have a very special guest, distinguished textual critic, Dr. Peter Gurry. He got he began his education at Moody Bible Institute, then got his master's from Dallas Theological Seminary, where he worked with the auspicious Daniel Wallace, who I'm sure many of you know, the pioneer of CSNTM, a resource that we all are very grateful nowadays for. And then he got his PhD from Cambridge, I believe under Peterhead, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, also another one of my favorite authors. So everybody, join me in welcoming Peter Gurry. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Sorry about the ray of light there in the background.
No,
That's a bit annoying.
It's an omen. It's an omen for the
omen of how great this will be.
Yes, enlightening. Thank you for joining us. I wanted today's stream to be more or less just strictly educational on the process of textual criticism. I've had the pleasure of interviewing people like David Trobish on the channel before, but that video turned out to be more or less touching upon his various theories and a compilation, the first edition of the New Testament. Yeah. But a lot of my followers, they're always texting me, sending me messages saying, what book should I get if I want to get into textual criticism, patristics and history and stuff like that. So I thought there would be no better person than for yourself to describe that for us. Can you please just tell us a little bit about what textual criticism is and your specific approach to it?
Sure. So really simply, textual criticism is, first of all, it sounds sort of negative. If you hear the word criticism, you think we're criticizing something and critiquing it. That's not quite right. Criticism is sort of an old 19th century English term that means sort of like careful study of something. So textual criticism refers to the study of any work that exists in multiple forms. And textual criticism is required to try to sort out the differences between those forms, usually to try to get back to what is considered to be the original author's form of the text. Now, depending on the work in question, whether it's an ancient work or in some cases modern works sometimes require textual criticism as well. People don't usually realize that, but certainly textual criticism is required on things written after the printing press. But yes, basically, when we're talking about ancient documents, it's a situation where you have something written a long time ago, right, that we don't have the original document of that anymore. What we have instead are copies, and they disagree with one another. And so textual criticism is that area of study that tries to sort out those differences.
Awesome.
That's I mean, you can complicate that definition, obviously, but that's basically
right. And it's not something unique for the New Testament, correct? It's something that has existed for many centuries, if not millennia. I know you guys introduced me to a PhD thesis by Amy Donaldson, where she spoke about the practice of textual criticism in the early church and gave like a good background. Can you give us a little bit of information on where this science originated, how it was kind of utilized by early Christians and theologians and even others?
Yeah. Well, you can if you want to find some, I mean, anywhere you have sort of scribal activity, you have at least the potential for the basics of textual criticism, right? So you can, in that sense, you could go back to a place like Ugarit, this ancient city that we discovered lots of clay tablets from, and you could find scribal activity there where scribes are correcting their own work, and you could call that a kind of rudimentary textual criticism. But certainly if you go back to, say, like Alexandria, Egypt, you have the famous scholars who worked on the text of Homer very much doing textual criticism, sorting out differences between their copies of Homer. You mentioned Amy Donaldson's dissertation. The church fathers certainly do a rudimentary form of textual criticism, meaning they are certainly aware of differences in their copies of the Bible, and at times they discuss those differences where it affects the interpretation. and sometimes they try to give solutions to various differences. So someone like Origen in the 2nd and 3rd century is certainly doing a form of textual criticism. When most people think of it, they probably are thinking of more it's more modern development, which you might date to, depending on when you want to do it. You could at least start with Erasmus in, say, the 16th century. That would be a good place to start, and that's helpful just because he's the first one to produce to publish the Greek New Testament. So in a way, it's nice to set a marker there with him and say, well, you could think that's sort of when textual criticism starts. At least in the sort of modern era. But yeah, you really, at least in rudimentary forms, if you just think of people trying to sort out differences between texts, you can find that as far back as you have texts. I think it's fair to say.
Okay. And when like growing up, I assume like you had like a Christian upbringing.
Yeah.
Of course, you went to Moody Bible Institute. What made you like kind of interested in like working with reconstructing the text, or like is it something that you came across, or because my first experience with anything about like textual variation was just in the footnotes of my ESV.
Yeah, for sure.
That's
that's how most people sort of encounter it. So I grew up in a home where my family was really supportive and interested in missions. So I knew about Bible translation from a very young age. We had missionaries stay in our homes who were working on Bible translations in places like Papua New Guinea and with small tribes in Mexico even. So I knew about Bible translation. I knew that there was a process involved in how we get the Bible, if I can put it that way, right, in broad terms. Then when I got to high school, I signed up for a Greek class. Instead of taking Spanish like most people did, I signed up to take a Greek class. And so I ended up taking 4 years of Koine Greek in high school, and there's when I got my first printed Greek New Testament. So that was really fun, and that was when I kind of really concretely could see, oh, this is the thing that's behind my English Bible. And I was the kind of over-eager student in high school who was like correcting my English Bible with my like 2 years of Greek, right? So I probably shouldn't have done that, but I realized there was a translation process, and I realized it could be improved, or you could have opinions about it. So then I got to Moody, and that's when I took more Greek classes, and that's when I first got into text criticism. That's when I first learned about how there were manuscripts behind my printed Greek New Testament. So honestly, it's kind of as simple as each step of the way, I just got fascinated by the fact that there was something behind what I had been using prior. So, at some point I realized, like you did, oh, there's something behind my ESV. What is that? Well, then I realized it was my printed Greek New Testament. Well, then at some point I realized, well, there's a whole lot of stuff behind that. So how does it get to this form? So I've just always been fascinated by that process of how do we go from, in the case of the New Testament, having thousands of hand copies of it, to having a printed edition that's pretty neat and tidy, to then having an English translation that's, for the most part, very understandable, right? Okay. So that's kind of the basic.
Just kind of like an inquisitive trajectory,
I suppose. Yeah, just curious. And also, when I first saw manuscripts, like pictures of them, and then eventually when I worked with Dan Wallace and got to go see him in person, that was just, that really hooked me, because every manuscript almost by definition is unique. It's handmade by definition, right? Mm-hmm. So no two are exactly alike either in terms of their text, but even more so just in terms of their format, their size, the material they're on. And so realizing the amount of effort that went into, basically the amount of effort that goes into me having an accessible Bible in English is pretty impressive to me.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And sometime along that process, you had to kind of choose your approach to textual criticism, correct? Because many of the listeners don't know. They think that it's kind of like a rigid science, and you have the manuscripts, they're dated, and you just kind of like work with that material in a certain like codified way. Can you please explain to my audience a little bit about the different approaches when it comes to like eclecticism, the majority text view, your more like reasoned view, etc.?
Yeah, I like that you called my view reasoned.
Yeah.
Reasonable. Yeah, the terms are. I didn't pick the terms.
Right.
Yeah, so there's kind of. I think that maybe the helpful way to think about it is, it's a bit of a spectrum in terms of how much a scholar thinks that they should pick a manuscript or group of manuscripts that they think is almost always right, and then edit the text within that manuscript or group of manuscripts, and that has the best chance of getting them back to the original text. Or, in my case, is what's called a reasoned eclectic. The term eclectic means I don't think there's any one manuscript or group of manuscripts that's always right. And so I am eclectic. I think that the original text could be found in a variety of manuscripts. And sometimes I need to find that original text in this manuscript. Sometimes I find it over here in this other one. So it's eclectic sort of in that sense. It's not arbitrary. Listeners should not get the impression that it's sort of arbitrary, that we just pick randomly, like eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Some manuscripts really are better than others. It's just that no manuscript is always right. Every manuscript has mistakes because copying by hand is hard. We're not humans are not machines. So there's theological reasons too we could get into that would be interesting, but that's the historical reason.
Okay. And
that's pretty basic. Okay, so that's pretty basic. So you mentioned the Byzantine majority position.
Right.
That would be a position I would characterize as saying they think that the original text is most likely to be found in what's called the Byzantine manuscripts, which also happen to be a very large group of manuscripts, right? They don't think every Byzantine manuscript is 100%, right, but they think the original text is most likely to be found within that group of manuscripts. And that group does tend to be, overall, pretty homogeneous. It's the manuscripts within it tend to agree with each other at a pretty high rate relative to some other types of manuscripts for the New Testament.
And I'm guessing the problem with that approach would be that it kind of omits the oldest manuscripts and the possibility that maybe a recension was formed, or maybe a more desirable form of the text was adopted, and the earliest, like, more accurate ones were deferred. And I know I heard you say one time that you're not concerned with anything except trying to get back to what the authors originally wrote. And I would assume that things like the oldest manuscripts would probably be something very important to look at if you want to get to that core.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that's the only thing I'm interested in. I'm also interested in just understanding how the text develops. If you want to, there are all sorts of historical benefits to knowing. For example, if you want to understand Martin Luther's theology, at some point it's important to know what text he was using for the New Testament, right? So I'm not uninterested in the later development of the text after the original text. I'm certainly interested in that as well. But yes, in terms of doing text criticism, I think the main goal is to get back to that original as best we can. Yeah, my problem with the Byzantine text is mainly a Byzantine priority position. Actually, mainly it's what I would call its exclusivism. It's notion that the original text is always within that group of Byzantine manuscripts, and I find that historically implausible. I don't think there's reason to think that any group of manuscripts is always right. Now, they would be clear. They don't think it's always right, but they think that the original text is always in it, which is what I mean by saying it's always right. I think there are times where even the Byzantine manuscripts, when they're all agreed, when all, depending on which book of the New Testament you're in, let's say you're in John and you've got 1,000 Byzantine manuscripts and they all have the same reading, I do think there's times where that can still, that huge number of manuscripts can still be wrong.
Okay.
Right. And part of that is because they tend to date later. So yes, the age of manuscripts is not conclusive, but I think it is an important factor.
Okay. And as a textual critic, do you do any work in dating those manuscripts, or do you just kind of go with the consensus designations to each of these? Because I know there are people like Brent Nongri who've opened the case for a lot of New Testament papyri. Also Orsini and Clarice, they've done some work on this as well. And then there are people on the other side like Kim and Thede who will date some manuscript. Yeah. I mean,
I don't think there's really anybody that takes their. I mean, they're sort of like maximalist early daters.
I mean,
but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in Philip Comfort's work, he kind of gave it a whole
Correct.
chapter. You wouldn't know that it's fringe if you just read Philip Comfort. But yeah, so like, do you when you said you had training in a textual critic, you've gone through years and years of working with this material. How much is like concentrated on actually like dating manuscripts, or is that a separate field?
Yes and no. So I did, like, for example, at Dallas Seminary, I did a class on paleography, an independent study just on paleography, where I studied how paleography works, how we date things through handwriting. It is a pretty specialized field. So what I would say is, I'm not a paleographer myself, and so I'm not an expert on dating. I don't have the kind of expertise that other people like somebody like Clarice has. And so, yeah, in general, I'm happy to defer to those people that have the expertise. But that doesn't mean that I don't have opinions, and doesn't mean that I just it does not mean I'm in a position where whatever the latest article is, I just have to say, well, that's the latest one, so it's right. So just because
Yeah,
Brent Nongre has been writing a series of articles, sort of wanting to push some dates back, or at least open the dates a bit wider, does not mean I think Brent's always right
hmm
to do that. And but yeah, dating it's not an exact science. It's also not completely arbitrary. Listeners sometimes get the misimpression that we're just sort of like guessing. Or we're not. Handwriting does develop over time, and you can chart that development. And we have lots of manuscripts that do have dates on them, where the scribe is, say, writing a letter or something, or maybe it's a literary work that's written on one side, and on the back side you have a letter that's written, and that tells us that the stuff on the other side couldn't have been written any later than that. So you have ways you can pinpoint this handwriting in time and sometimes in space, but usually just in time.
that's like an epistograph, right? Or
An epistograph, yeah, would be written on two sides where one side is sort of reused. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, would I call myself an expert paleographer? No, I would certainly not do that. But you can't really be a text critic without learning
right.
about how dating works, if that makes sense. I don't know. I don't want to oversell. I don't want to oversell or undersell my my
I appreciate
paleography skills
it.
here. But
Yeah.
yes, I've certainly studied paleography. I've had a chance to look at lots of manuscripts in person, and I've taken a paleography class at the University of Oxford, things like that. So again, I don't want to
Awesome.
oversell it, but I'm not a
Awesome.
total novice.
Thank you. Very humble. And speaking of things that are like not very exact,
Yeah.
can you speak a little bit about the methodology that's employed? I know people like Keith Elliott, they
hmm
have like a methodology in which like internal evidence is to be preferred over basically anything else.
Yeah.
What is your opinion on like the methodology that's employed, and do those methodologies conflict, and how hard is it to kind of employ them in practice?
Hmm. So just so listeners know, there's kind of two types of evidence that we tend to discuss. One we call internal evidence, and one we call external. So when we come across, say, two manuscripts, and one has reading A and one has reading B, we start to ask a series of questions about where the evidence lies in terms of which reading is probably earlier. Okay. External evidence is that evidence we glean from the manuscript it's found in. Okay. So that can be that's everything from the date of the manuscript to, if it's not Greek, let's say it's a version, let's say it's Syriac or Latin or Coptic, it has to do with the translation involved. What kind of translation is it? Is it a really literal translation, or is it a really loose translation? Okay, those are all things that might fall under the category of external evidence. You're also thinking about, say, the quality of the manuscript as a whole. Okay, internal evidence then is internal to the text as a text. So with internal evidence, you're asking questions about, well, within the context here, given the sentence as a whole, given the paragraph as a whole, which reading makes more sense in the context? Which reading fits with what we know about this author's style or his theology, things like that. So,
that
for
kind of
example,
that
yeah,
kind
go
of
ahead.
presupposes that you have enough of the author reconstructed in order to make that deduction.
It does, which by pretty much every account you do. So
hmm
except in cases of like if we're dealing with something very subtle like a conjunction, does Mark use this conjunction or that conjunction? Does Mark use the word that after the word Jesus said? Okay,
Yeah.
because Greek doesn't have to use the word that. after somebody says something. That's the kind of area where you go through the rest of it and you say, where are all the places where we have that same verb where there's no question in the manuscripts as to what the original is, and there's lots of those, right? So then you can start to build up a sense of, well, here's Mark's typical style. But you're right, with something like that subtle, you're undoubtedly going to find places where Mark either doesn't use the word that after the verb, okay, or where there is some question in some of your examples because of the manuscript differences. So that may be one where you go, boy, I don't feel comfortable enough to say what Mark's style is definitively. Okay, so you just set that piece of evidence aside. But if it's something like, take say a famous variant, a difficult one, Jesus' prayer from the cross, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do. There's no question at all in terms of the manuscripts go that Luke has a pretty important theme of what we call the theme of ignorance in both Luke and Acts. The theme of ignorance meaning the people who crucified Jesus did not realize the gravity of what they were doing or the significance of who they were crucifying. Does this make sense? So ignorance not in the sense of innocence at all, but ignorance in the sense of being unaware of the gravity of what they were doing. Right. So kind of a tragic ignorance, if I can put it that way. There's no doubt at all from the manuscripts that Luke has that theme. Do you see? So when we come to that prayer from the cross, we should naturally ask, one of the questions we ask in terms of internal evidence is, does this prayer fit with Luke's theology elsewhere in Luke and Acts? And the answer is, yeah, actually it fits really, really well. So that's an argument in favor of it being original, is that, man, it seems to fit his theology quite well. So no, I actually don't think that the variants that we have elsewhere are usually that big of a problem when we're thinking about the author's style, because the text overall is so stable, and most variants are so easy to resolve that actually we can have a pretty striking sense of an author's style. Now, the problem though is just in general, using author style to decide a difference can sometimes be a bit subjective, right? Because nobody's style is sort of 100% all the time. Do you see? Every author varies his style at some points. So the risk at some point is you're trying to write better than the author you're editing. No author's totally consistent either. So that one, but that all fits under internal evidence. So traditionally what happens is you have both those categories, external evidence and internal evidence, and you're trying to weigh them both. And there are many times where both sets of evidence point in the same direction, and you have great confidence. You say, okay, both the external evidence and the internal evidence is pointing in this direction. That's the original text. Okay, we have good reason to believe that. Other times, though, no, they don't. So sometimes you go, man, internally, this reading has the most in its favor. But wow, this other one is found in the earlier, better manuscripts. And then you have a bit of a tension, right? So those would be places where our Greek New Testaments might print the text in brackets, or nowadays in Nestle Law 28 they use a little diamond symbol to mark some uncertainty on the editor's part. So yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned this is a very perfect segue to like the virginal witnesses. You mentioned Luke's theme of ignorance on the part of the accusers and the persecutors of Jesus. There is a little dialogue that's found in like the Old Latin and the Old Syriac where they beat their breasts and they say, "Woe to us, for the destruction of Jerusalem is near." That kind of fits in right with Luke's theology, because like it seems like after the crucifixion they don't know what they've done, and then they kind of lament over this. And and I know D.C. Parker and Keith Elliott, they both think that this might be original to Luke's gospel. Like, do you have an opinion on that?
What verse is this? This is not familiar to me. It's not ringing a bell.
I think it's Luke 23 or Luke 22. It's after the crucifixion. It's found in like I believe it's in Beze, if I'm not mistaken. Beze in the Old Latin and the Old Syriac. Yeah, it says, and they say, "Woe to us, for the destruction is near." It's in it's in a specific chapter of the living text of the Gospels. He went through it.
Right. It's been a while since I read that. Forgive me.
Yeah.
I'd have to go back and look at it. So my sort of off the cuff answer is probably gonna be worth very little. But if it's actually only found in the So Old Latin and Beza and maybe some
Yeah.
Syriac. I'm inclined to think no. That's every reason to
Okay.
think it's not original.
Okay.
So
And
that would be external evidence, right? Going, well, we know that Beza. I mean, basically any reading that's found any reading that's found only in Beza, at least in Greek, is immediately on my bad list. Okay, Codex Beza is not the kind of manuscript that you want to be basing your text on.
yeah, it has
It's too quirky.
okay. But that question was more or less kind of directed towards the versional witnesses. How important are they when doing textual criticism?
Yeah, there's some discussion about this, and people have different opinions. Some people think they're more important than others do. I tend to, my view is of course correct. I think they're, I mean, I think they are. I think they're important, especially in larger variants, because the versions often we have some sense. Well, we always have some sense of where they're made and used. So, for example, Syriac the Syriac translation is not being used in France, in ancient, like in Gaul. Okay, Irenaeus is not reading his New Testament in Syriac. Okay, likewise, the Syriac-speaking church fathers are not reading their New Testament in Latin. So these versions, especially the three early ones, Syriac, Coptic, and Latin, can be very helpful in giving us some geographical reference points for reading. So take something like the Prayer from the Cross. Okay, that's that's a large enough variant that issues of translation that otherwise be a problem, because no two languages are the same, right? So when you get to the fine points of something like I mentioned, sort of the word that, if you're looking at a variant in Mark's gospel and you're wondering, does the word that belong there after the word your words Jesus said? Syriac may not be able to help you.
Mm-hmm.
Because that may just simply be a translator. The translator doesn't need the word that in his Greek text to be able to put the word that in Syriac if he wants to. Okay, just like you could not take your ESV and get back to the Greek text behind it perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way you would do that, right? Why? Because English is just too different than Greek, and translation by its nature is not one-to-one ever. Okay, so with finer details in the text, the translations tend to be less helpful, but in larger variants, they can be, I think, quite helpful because they give us a sense of where a reading was and when it was.
Okay.
So that would be my general take, is I think the versions are important. Some people will say, well, they're rarely decisive. Okay, that may be, but that doesn't mean they're not important. I mean, something doesn't have to be decisive to still matter. So that would be my sort of view. That said, I'm not in the sort of a camp that would say, I think there was a tendency, maybe especially like 100 years ago, when some of these when some of the old Syriac manuscripts were first discovered, there was a sort of natural tendency to think, these have given us readings that really, that are original and they're only found in the Syriac. And it's always sort of a temptation for humans when we discover something new to think this is going to be the key piece of the puzzle that we've always needed, and to kind of put a little bit too much weight on it. And there's a bit of that, especially like, at least in my knowledge of the history of like the discovery of some of these versions. I think that happened a bit with like the old Syriac Gospels. It's not to say they're not important, but it is. I think it's probably rare that that the original text is preserved only in the versions. I think that's probably fair to say. And that's just what people mean when they say something like the versions are not decisive.
Right.
That's probably
they're supportive. They're supportive. I guess.
Yep. Yep. So that's kind of how I would think of them.
Okay. And you mentioned again a perfect segue. You mentioned that Irenaeus would not be reading from like a Syriac or from like the Diatessaron, especially with his views on Tatian anyway. But like in terms of the patristic authors, I know in this book, Myths and, which I highly recommend everyone to get, Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism, probably the most important book in like the field of comparative like theology or like ministry or apologetics that's been released in the last 50 years. It's awesome. You have a chapter here that's dedicated to the myth of like reconstructing the text of the New Testament from the writings of the church fathers. Yeah. And I forgot who the contributor was for that chapter, but they did a really good job of like kind of honing in on where that myth started.
Yeah.
And the general value of that statement in
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm looking for my
many.
copy.
I know there's
It's
too many
lost somewhere in
voices.
there. It's fine.
Yeah, it's all
I
good.
should know, but
But can you speak to like, because every time like sometimes we speak to people and we're discussing things like the Comma Johannium, and the general response would be, well, Cyprian mentions it, or it's mentioned by this Latin author or this Latin author. So and so how can you explain to us how that what is designated as a myth came about, and its status and accuracy?
Well, the myth is basically a kind of an apologetic one on our side, where and you can find this in some, like the quote. I think we give a quote in that chapter from Bruce Metzger. So this is not just like a pop apologetic, like something that happens on YouTube.
Yeah.
Bruce Metzger is not like a YouTube apologist. Let's be clear. Okay.
Dan Wallace too in a couple of presentations.
Yeah. So the way the myth has been stated is the church fathers quote the New Testament so much that even if we had no Greek manuscripts, we could still reconstruct the text of the New Testament just from their quotations. Okay. What's true, sort of behind the myth, is that the church fathers really do quote the New Testament a lot. Okay. That is true. There's no doubt about that. They quote it a ton. What's not true is that they quote every single verse. That's not true. Or that we have record of them quoting every single verse. That would be wild if we did, I think. And what's certainly not true, it's the way, at least the way I stated it, and I can give the impression that somehow we could actually reconstruct the New Testament if all we had were their quotations. That doesn't even really make sense, because their quotations usually are not like, and now let me quote Mark's gospel in full.
Right.
Right? It's in the course of theological writings and sermons and debates and all that. So they may be quoting a verse or two or three, sometimes if you're lucky, a paragraph of Mark. But they're not giving you like a running text. So the idea that somehow, somewhere, somebody could take all the church fathers say, the point is, you actually have to know what the New Testament is to even recognize the fact that the church fathers are quoting it. Does that make sense?
Great point. Yeah.
Where I think the myth is, where I think there's legitimacy to the claim is yes, it is absolutely true that the church fathers quote the New Testament a ton. It's also true that sometimes they can be very helpful in helping us resolve differences in our manuscripts. That's true. The church fathers are a help, especially in certain variations, like you mentioned, the woman caught in adultery, the longer ending of Mark, precisely because they can help us know when a text was known, when and where. Right. So if Irenaeus is quoting from the longer ending of Mark in the 2nd century in France, wow, that means the longer ending of Mark exists in copies of Mark in the 2nd century. That's really significant, because that's earlier than our earliest Greek manuscript of that chapter. Right. So the church fathers can be quite significant. But the myth is that this idea that somehow they quoted it so much, or that they quoted every verse, that somehow we could reconstruct it. It's, again, the point of the claim is to say that we have an overwhelming amount of evidence to work with. Yeah, there's truth to that. We do. We have a ton of evidence to work with. The idea that somehow we don't have enough evidence to do what we need to do in New Testament text criticism is, I think, only a view that people who don't know the subject matter would believe, or that people who've never worked in text criticism in any other area would believe. Our problem is not a lack of evidence for the text of the New Testament. It really is. Would we like more? Sure, I'll always take more. Historians are greedy people, right? Text critics are certainly greedy people. But the idea that somehow if we just had a few more manuscripts, or the right manuscripts, that would resolve everything is naive, in my opinion.
Yeah, especially when they're handwritten. And again, a perfect segue. You have a knack for this. I remember when P5575 was first on a popular level exposed. I saw a tweet of yours, and
the first century Mark. Is this what you're talking about?
No, the
or the sayings of Jesus.
Almost Q-ish, sayings of Jesus, with Thomas Logion on there.
Yeah.
And you made a tweet, or now an X, and an X something nowadays.
Whatever an X is.
Yeah, and you said, I remember that fragment. I worked on it in seminary, and this was years ago. So I always tell that anecdote. I'm like, how much of this is there? Like, how many of these manuscripts are still sitting around, waiting to be cataloged or archived?
Yeah, a fair number. So when the whole 1st century Mark fragment thing was happening, that whole fiasco, if listeners don't remember, there was a supposed 1st century fragment of Mark that when it was actually published, it was dated the 2nd or 3rd century. But when that happened, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
That's P129, right? I think. I'm not mistaken.
P129.
That might have
can't be right. It's got to be later than that. What is its number?
Okay.
Is it P129? I don't think so, but I can't remember. Sorry.
1st century Mark, yeah.
Anyways, when that happened, it turned out to be a papyrus from the Oxyrhynchus collection, which is housed mostly in Oxford, although there are Oxyrhynchus papyri all over the world in university libraries and stuff, in museums. But the bulk of the collection that's unpublished is still is housed in a library in Oxford. And I've seen it in person, so I've actually seen the shoe boxes full of unpublished papyri, and I can just tell you there are a lot of them. When the Egypt Exploration Society, which sort of owns the unpublished ones anyway, when they found out about this 1st century Mark fragment that had been almost stolen from them, that's the short version of the story. When they realized it had been almost stolen, they went through their own sort of catalogs, and they identified something like a dozen New Testament papyri. I want to say, I haven't kept tabs on them, so I'm probably the wrong person to ask. I want to say maybe one of those has been published since then, and so the rest we're waiting for them to be published. Wow. So over the next probably 20 years, we'll get maybe 1 or 2 every year. They will probably be small fragments. Okay, we're not talking about like Sinaiticus being published. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think you can assume that we will be. I mean, my Nestle Lawn 28 has papyri up to P1. Let me see real quick. Hold on. What is it? P125. We're now up to something like P145. Okay.
Yeah.
And this came out in what, 2015? Is that right?
Yeah, I got mine right here.
2012. Sorry, 2012. Okay. So what is that? 12, 13 years ago. So that's about an average of 1 a year. I would say that's probably a good way to think about it. You can probably bank on 1 a year. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but that's a fairly good average. That's pretty great. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But again, they're fragmentary, right? So if people are expecting that their Bible is going to dramatically change, that's only because they don't know the history of the discipline. I think the most dramatic changes have already been made to the Greek New Testament text since the time of, say, people like Westcott and Hort. But
yeah. And you mentioned like the Oxyrhynchus collection, and I know they have there's a fragment, a very small fragment of supposedly against heresies, P.Oxy 405, and you mentioned that Irenaeus might have quoted from the longer ending of Mark, and I know there's like a dispute over like how, or not so much a dispute, but there's a methodological, I guess, difference of opinion on how much to take the church fathers as witnesses for a text if no critical text exists for them, or if they only exist on like versional recensions and whatnot. So for people like Irenaeus, or where the Greek has been like completely lost, can somebody take that to the bank, like Irenaeus quoted from the longer ending of Mark, even though like the manuscripts are maybe medieval?
Okay, I'm not an Irenaeus expert, so can I answer a slightly different question?
Sure.
I don't want to give the impression that I'm an Irenaeus expert here.
Okay.
Maybe the question might be, how skeptical should we be about uses of the church fathers for textual criticism? Mm-hmm. Something like that, I don't think very skeptical, because when if you read the context of when Irenaeus quotes it, it's not like Irenaeus makes some big deal about it. Do you know? He's not like, and now I'm going to prove that the longer ending of Mark is in my copies of of Mark. Yeah. He just quotes it in the course of his longer argument. So no later scribe would have any reason to insert the text of the longer ending of Mark there. It wouldn't. There's no indication that that's happened at all. So, and any difference of translation between, say, Greek and Latin, I don't think is going to be an issue there at all, because I think, if I remember right, he quotes the whole verse. So at best, you're going to be dealing with like, did he use a Greek article or not, which is not relevant to the question at hand. The question at hand is, does Irenaeus seem to know the longer ending of Mark? The answer, I think, is yes. So I don't think there's actually any cause for doubt on that one. With other cases of the church fathers, Sure, you have issues like, I mean, where things get more interesting is where you have a church father quoting the same verse, say 3 times, and each time it's a little bit different. Then you have to ask the question, well, what was in this church father's manuscript? And there are some times where you just have to say, I can't be sure, right? Other times you can look at the context of where they quote it, and you can say, oh, well, obviously, when he quotes it this other time, he changes the pronoun to fit his own context a little bit better. Just like, any preacher today would do the same thing when they're quoting the Bible. They might change a pronoun from, I to you to make clear the application to their audience. Do you see? They're not claiming to sort of change the Bible. They're just making clear that how their interpretation of it applies to their particular audience. So there are times where you can use the context of the church father and say, well, I'm pretty sure, he quotes the verse 2 different ways, but I'm pretty sure this time over here, he's changed it to fit his context a little bit better, just to make it a bit smoother, right? So probably we should think this.
What's called like a lemma, right? The lemma is not reading from it.
Yeah, exactly. So you can think that the other one is probably the text that he had in his manuscript. But yeah, you're raising some of the difficulties of using the church fathers. In the case of the long writing of Mark, I don't think there's any real doubt that Irenaeus knew it.
Okay, awesome, thank you. And you mentioned before, like some minor variations with regards to like the stylistic choices an author would make, conjunctions, particles, et cetera, et cetera. But can you give us like some of the more harder decisions or the harder readings that you've had to work through? I think you mentioned Jude 5 in one interview before. Does it still keep you up at night, or have you sorted that out?
No, because I'm writing a commentary on it. I've already written that part of the commentary, so my view is solidified and done.
Nice.
I think so. It's interesting. I think probably Jesus is the original reading, in part because it's a little bit harder.
It's the harder reading,
because he's used the word Lord just in the context. Also, I think it's the only time he uses the name Jesus in the short letter. So for those reasons, I think the other thing is I think it's much more easy to explain how Jude would have written Jesus, and then someone later would have changed it to Lord rather than the other way around.
Or God Jesus, I think P72 has.
Yeah, P72 is a bit weird. But yes, it does have an odd reading there. What's interesting is in the context of Jude, it's the same referent either way. So in the context, it has to be a reference to Jesus either way. Okay. It's really only a question of whether Jude calls him Lord, Kurios, there, or does he call him Jesus? What's surprising about Jesus is that that's his human name, right? And he's describing something that he did prior to the incarnation. So prior to his human existence, namely, he led a people out of Egypt and then later destroyed those who did not believe. Those are events that are recorded in the book of Exodus, right? So to say that Jesus did them, that's a pretty, what would I say? Attention-grabbing way to say it, right?
Yeah.
So I'm still actually wrestling through the sort of potential theological implications of that. I've talked to some friends who are trained theologians, and they're like, this is not a problem at all, basically. Yeah. When you have proper Christology, that's not a problem at all. And you can find, that's why I think the early church didn't really have that big of a problem with it. I don't think it was changed because they were bothered by it per se. I think scribes might have just changed it because it was a bit unusual, but not necessarily because they were theologically bothered by it. You can find, for example, Justin Martyr in the 2nd century. He attributes the Exodus to Jesus as well.
Yeah.
So already on any reading, you have Christians in the 2nd century, saying basically what I'm arguing Jude says in the first. Mm-hmm. So, and that's when I've settled, I think.
That you've settled. Okay. Are there any more that are still like arduous in your?
Oh, sure. Sure. Trying to think which ones come to mind. I mean, I'm not necessarily working on anything in particular right now. That's
maybe John 1:18.
No, actually, haven't done much work on that one.
Okay.
And that one doesn't. I've just never gotten into it that much. I need to probably at some point.
Mm-hmm.
No, but the one I mentioned, Jesus' prayer from the cross. Yeah, that's one that I still wrestle with. And I think in Myths and Mistakes, I intentionally don't take a position on it. I think since then I would lean more towards seeing that prayer from the cross as original to Luke's gospel.
Okay.
The external evidence is pretty evenly balanced. It's clear from this. Okay, here's another place where the church fathers can be very helpful. We know that early Christians were troubled by that prayer from the cross, which is always surprising to modern Christians because modern Christians think that's an awesome prayer. But early Christians were troubled by it.
It's in Acts, right? Stephen repeats it almost in Acts.
He does. It's not exact, and that's one of the arguments against it has been, well, it's interpolated from Acts, but it's not close enough. That does not. If somebody interpolated it from Stephen's prayer, they did a bad job of it because it's not the language is not close enough. Obviously, it's the same type of prayer in the same type of situation, but no, it's not. I don't think it's interpolated from there. I don't think that explains it in Luke. And that's partly why I've started to lean more toward it being authentic and original, is I just can't come up with a good explanation for where it came from if it's not original to Luke. I think that's
it's in Hegesippus too, if I'm not mistaken. Hegesippus.
It is. Yep, it is. But again, it's not exact. And the problem with the problem with that is it's just circular, right? You say, oh, it comes from Hegesippus.
Or Hegesippus.
Why doesn't it go the other? Yeah, exactly. So you really even that doesn't really get you very far. At best, you can say that could be the source, but it could just as well be the other way around. Do you see? So yeah, those two other sources, though, are not close enough to convince me that that's where it came from. I think it's more likely that the influence, if I can put it this way, is running the other direction. So I think Stephen's prayer, for example, is meant to remind us of Jesus' prayer that we've already read in Luke's gospel by the time we get to Luke. Because a major theme, I think, in the book of Acts is the way the apostles continue the ministry of Jesus. They do miracles just like he did, right? And so this would be an example of that, of an apostle doing something very, very similar to Jesus as a way to affirm the apostles' authority. But one of the other things that so we have, this is where the church fathers can be important, because the church fathers discuss this prayer and they're troubled by it. So that could explain how it's omitted in some of our early manuscripts, that someone was bothered enough by it that they took it out.
Wow.
And that's probably the best explanation for why it's missing, because there's just no good mechanical explanation for its omission. There's no accidental omission, right? That would be nice if there were, because that would make an easy solution to it. But it's not like there's a repeated word at the beginning of the prayer and at the end, and a scribe accidentally just skipped over it. Scribes do, of course, leave things out accidentally. They do, but this is a bit long for just an accidental omission with no sort of visual cue, if I can put it that way. No visual.
Like Homoitaliaton or
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And I only have you for a little while longer. I want to take advantage, for lack of better terms. Okay. And one of the last methodological differences between a textual critic such as yourself and some people like at Munster. So I know D.C. Parker favors this, Klaus Wachtel, and some others. To what extent can you reconstruct the New Testament? Are you still working with Tyndale House, that critical edition, or?
I never did. I never was officially part of the editorial team on it.
Okay, but
I just know them well.
Peter Williams and John Kind and stuff. Okay, they have like a different perspective on. Of course, they're trying to reconstruct the original text. Can you speak about that methodological perspective about where that text leads us eventually?
Sure. So there's a little bit of a discussion among professional text critics as to what our goal should be. Some people, the traditional goal has been we should try to recover the author's text. Okay. Some people have objected to that on various grounds. Some have objected because they think, well, maybe that could be the goal, but we'll never get there, so we shouldn't try. Okay, so some people would sort of argue because we can't really get there, we shouldn't try. Others might say we shouldn't even bother trying. Whether we could get there or not, there's more interesting things to do. Does that make sense? So it's not always clear. Different people, I'm not sure David Parker comes at it the same way that everybody else does, who maybe shares some of his skepticism about an original text. I think for David Parker, he would argue there really is no such thing as an original text for the Gospels, right? I personally find that completely unpersuasive. I'm not sure it even really makes sense, frankly.
Me too, to be honest. At least the way he presents it in the living text.
Yeah, I think it's kind of doesn't. I think basically what David Parker wanted to say in that book is, well, I don't know. I'm not entirely sure what he wanted to say, but I think he doesn't like the idea of a single authoritative text, frankly. I think it has something to do with authority. That's partly what is stuck in his craw that he wants to address there. So that's a bit more of a theological issue.
Yeah.
But I think historically, I don't think it's a problem to think that there's an original text. I also don't think that our evidence is so bad that we can't get back to it. Are there places where we will continue to debate which reading is the original? Of course. Yeah. I mean, that's sort of like asking, will humans continue to debate everything? Yes, they will. Like, right. Of course we will. But my own personal view is, no, I think the goal of the original text, the author's text, is a good one. It's historically defensible. Theologically, I think is important as well. And I think we have enough evidence in most cases to be confident that we can get back to it. Even in places where we're still not completely sure, like where I have doubts, the prayer from the cross. It's not a question. It's not a question of, is there an original text in our manuscripts? It's a question of which text in our manuscripts is the original one. Do you see? That's a little bit different. So the idea that maybe like lots of the text of the New Testament has been irreparably corrupted and lost, I think is simply not true. The evidence is overwhelming that that's not true in most cases. Are there these isolated instances? Yeah, for sure. People will continue to debate the longer ending of Mark, at least at some level, mostly for theological reasons, I think, more than historical ones. Yeah. But nobody really is debating today 1 John 5:7, right? Nobody's really debating that anymore.
Yeah.
So am I confident that we have the original text of 1 John chapter 5, especially in those two verses? Yeah. Yeah, I am. So I always try to remind people when people, ask me like, how many variants are there? People always want to know how many variants are there and how many of them matter. My typical answer is to say the question has to be asked a bit better. It has to be asked, how many variants matter and to whom do they matter? Okay, so I'm going to call you out here just a little bit, right? Why are you having me on your show?
I have to answer that?
Yes.
Oh, because you're a scholar and I'm tired of answering WhatsApp messages.
So. Okay, fair enough. Okay, but it's also because you're a Muslim, right? And this is an issue that Muslims have with the Bible, correct?
Okay.
At some level.
We do, at some level.
Okay, at some level. I'm not trying to pick on you. I'm just saying, like, let's just be clear, right?
I'm going to end this right now. I'm just going
I'm turning the tables on you, my friend. I told you I got to ask you questions.
All right, let's go.
So because people have theological interest in this, the answer is going to matter differently to different people. So I'll sometimes say, how many variants matter to me as a professional text critic? The answer is at some level, depending on what question I'm asking, they all matter. They all matter because they all have the potential to teach me something about how scribes did their work. You mentioned Peter Head, my supervisor. One thing that he taught me early on is he said, Peter, you learn the most about how scribes did their work, not when they did their work well, but when they did it bad, like when they made mistakes. That's when you have the most to learn from them. It's when they make a flub as they're copying that you learn something about how they held the pen or something like that, right? So as a text critic trying to study how scribes did their work, what challenges did they face, what kind of mistakes were they prone to make, I learn a lot from the really boring variants that nobody else cares about. So which variants matter to me? At some level, the answer is all of them. But which variants matter to my mom who's doing her devotions in the morning from her English Bible? The answer is most of them don't matter at all because they do not affect the larger message of what she's reading. Then you could go from there. Which variants matter to me? And I'm writing my commentary on the book of Jude, more of them, but still not as many. If I were writing a different commentary, a more technical commentary, I'd have to deal with more of them. Or if I were an editor, then more would matter. But that was a different amount than what matter if I'm preaching a sermon, right? In which case I probably wouldn't mention any of them. I might mention the Jude 5 one because it's in people's Bibles, right? But for the most part, I'm not going to mention variants because my sermon is not based on the exact, like, did Jude write this word or that word? my sermon just doesn't depend on that level of detail, which not to say that level of detail doesn't matter. It certainly does. And even at theological level, I'd say it matters at some level. But we just need to kind of keep things in perspective. And this is where, as a Christian, we might have a different view than some Muslims in terms of their view of the Quran. I don't think textual variation is a problem for Christians the way it might be for some Muslims in their view of the Quran. But that might be a different conversation.
No, for sure. Yeah, it's very, very important to us. And can you just describe before you go, people think that a variant is like how many individual manuscripts have a different wording. And that's something that you also discuss in the book too, like how variants are counted, like which ones the apparatus actually considers, whether they're spelling or singular, or like, can you just define that for us if you don't mind?
Sure. So the way I would define a variant is any difference in wording between two manuscripts. Okay. So if you've got 300 manuscripts that have reading A and one manuscript that has reading B, you have one variant.
Right. Okay? Not 301.
Yeah. Or technically you could define that as two variants.
Oh, yeah.
One reading in this one reading in this one, that's two. Okay. But you do not have 300 variants. Okay. Yeah. That's a way of counting that goes at least as far back to B.B. Warfield. I don't know where he got that. To me, it's a wild way of counting. But occasionally you'll see that in Christian apologetics where they'll try to sort of make the large number of variants seem a lot smaller by saying, well, yeah, but think about how they count them. It's not that big a deal. Mm-hmm. Those of us who work in this area of field, we never count them that way. What was your other question, though? How many make it into your Greek New Testament?
Like in the apparatus, at least. Do spelling variants count, or
no? Almost never. So, you basically in your apparatus you only find spelling differences there if it affects the meaning. So really, that at that point, then you're not actually talking about a spelling difference.
Like Simeon and Simon or something like that.
Yeah, although that one might be like in Second Peter, excuse me.
Yeah.
Although I don't think there's actually a variant there. But yes, you might get a spelling difference with something like a name, just because the spelling of a name might matter more. But if it's like the Greek word "but," Allah can be spelled with an alpha at the end, or they can cut the alpha off, what we call, they can elide it. Yeah. That's a spelling difference that's almost never going to make it into your apparatus, even though you'll find it all through manuscripts, right? Because it's you have certain words you can just spell, just like in English, you can spell two different ways without affecting the meaning. And spelling changes, and there's no standards. You got to remember, English spelling isn't standardized until a couple hundred years ago. You could go back and read. I could show you early English printed Bibles and show you they don't spell consistently, right, in the Bible. So the idea that we have that spelling is somehow this thing that must be set and consistent, that's a fairly modern conception. One I'm thankful for, don't get me wrong. It's beneficial, it has its uses, but most people in history have not been terribly worried about different ways of spelling things.
The amount of times I have to conjure up I before E except after C when I write anything is amazing, and I still forget.
You live in the wrong time, my friend. If you lived 200, 300 years ago, nobody would have cared.
Yeah, I would have had more problems though. But yeah. I think I don't want to hold you too long. We got like 2 minutes left, but it's been a pleasure. Like everything that you're describing is like the like introductory aspects of textual criticism. That's why I wanted to get people to understand that from a very authoritative perspective, and then have them kind of search into the footnotes, as you will, or the rabbit holes, and look at the variants themselves, and maybe pick up the interest.
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage people that the most important differences are not hidden. They're not, I mean, you mentioned the one in Luke about them beating their breasts. I don't even know that one. I'm not saying it's not there, but I'm not familiar with that one. That's probably not in any English Bible, and the reason is almost certainly because most people don't think it has any real credit to it. But if people want to know where these variants are, pick up a good translation. I would recommend, for this case, read the Net Bible. You can just Google netbible.org, mainly because of any translation, it has the most discussion of textual variants in it. Yeah. And so it will, if you don't know Greek, which I'm going to assume most of our listeners do not, that's probably your best way to access these variants in English and to kind of see what's going on.
Okay, and also encourage learning Greek, learning Latin.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, very active. I still love it. So I mean, it's very good reading, just like directly from the text. But yeah, I want to. How's your family doing, by the way? I know you have like a comparatively large one.
I have a comparatively large one.
God
True.
bless
If we're
you.
comparing to families today, I have 6 kids. So yes, for
It's now.
today's standards, I have a lot of kids.
Okay, that's so good. So I think
I love kids.
the reading "Be fruitful and multiply" that's original.
Yeah, that is original, and I have applied it and successfully.
That was supposed to be my icebreaker. I kept it till the end. I don't know why, but
You didn't need
I'm
it, my
glad.
friend.
I'm glad. Thank you
Good.
so much. This has been excellent. Thank you so much for your time. It was smooth, setting this up. And
Yeah.
hopefully we can do something like more like if you want to present maybe in the future on some of the things that you work on in the text itself. Do you want to leave us with any work that you've been doing or any publications? I know you have. So Professor Gurry has books on. I don't want to mention the CBGM because that would have taken like 20 minutes. But yeah, with Tommy Wasserman, there's a good book if you are more if you're more like interested in this field, which is it's amazing. He has a book on new perspectives on textual criticism, an introduction to the coherence-based coherence-based genealogical method. Yeah, and then you're part of the Text and Canon Institute.
Yeah,
where you
so I
work with
co-direct that. Yep, with my colleague John Mead. So
John Mead. Yeah.
listeners can go to textandcanon.org. We try to publish about one new article a month on something related to the history of the Bible, whether it's questions of canon or text or translation. Those are kind of our 3 main areas that we focus on and help people understand what I consider to be the amazing story about how we got the Bible.
Yeah, nice. Thank you. Good plug for Of Scribes and Scripture. Very good book. Very good book. You guys can pick it up from Amazon. John Mead is also an excellent scholar. I can't wait. Has he finished his hexaplar or no?
Well, he's finished his edition of about half of the book of Job. Yes.
Okay.
He is currently working on the other part of Job with another scholar who did the bulk of the work, I think. So, but yeah, that's a sort of a lifelong project.
Yeah, and
for sure.
As far as like the free material, definitely check out Evangelical Textual Criticism blog. That is just an incredible resource. You have distinguished scholars like Peter Gurry, Peter Head, Peter Williams, Philip Payne, James Snap. It makes some contributions there as well, and they're discussing variants, discussing methodology, discussing dating. It's an awesome website. I mean, you can sit there and binge for weeks and just become a novice textual critic just from that, really. But thank you so much for doing that. From your own like free and spare time. That's really awesome. To like kind of give us the crumbs that fall from your academic paper. So I really appreciate
the crumbs. You're very welcome.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you all. Thank you so much for watching and listening wherever you are. And we always end these streams with a prayer in Islam, because the Prophet, peace be upon him, he said, he is not from my nation, he who does not show mercy to the little ones, nor reveres our elders, nor gives to the scholar his rightful due. So I hope we've hosted you properly and given you your rightful due, even though you didn't ask for anything in return. I really appreciate that as well. But yeah, and subhanak Allahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. And thank you again, everyone, and we'll see you guys on the next one.